So I started writing about 12, 13 years ago. So this is in 2008, right when I was graduating from university. And so I was very interested in pursuing my master's in archaeology. So I had a background in anthropology, history, and I wanted to sort of pursue my doctorate eventually in anthropology. And unfortunately, at that point, what happened was that my CGPA was actually pretty bad. So I was talking to one of my professors, and her advice to me was that I could do a bit of extracurricular work and essentially build up my resume, and then they should help me get into a good college. So that's how my writing mostly started. So I'm like, I thought about, okay, so what I'll do is I'll try to do some internship with some archaeologists, वगैरह, but nothing really worked out. But so what happened was that I was very lucky, fortunate to meet somebody called Iqbal Kaisar, who's had a huge impact on my work. He had come to Lums for a particular talk, and he's somebody who's not very formally educated, like he's not a professor in that sense, but he's somebody who's traveling around Pakistan, exploring Hindu, Sikh shrines, and that's something that I wanted to do. I mean, that's one reason why I wanted to be in archaeology, was to be physically, so not think of history just as what is in the books, but think of history as essentially travel, think of history as being physically in those places. So I just sort of clung on to him and asked him to show me Pakistan through his sort of view. And we started traveling. I started writing articles, and every other plan that sort of disintegrated. And yeah, I started really enjoying doing this, and I've been doing it well now for 12 years, 12, 13 years.
I love that. एक चीज जब आप बोल रहे थे इसके बारे में, one thing that stood out to me was, and I think I've noticed this myself as well, like every single time I've tried to kind of go to a bookstore or a library and kind of look for work that either from folklore or historical perspectives of Pakistan, or even really amazing poetry, like जो बहुत well known होंगे, like Faiz, Iqbal, these kinds of guys you're going to get a translation for. The unfortunate truth with me is I don't read Urdu, and so a lot of the times वो जो टक्कर लग जाती है ना कि आप कुछ ढूंढना चाहते हो but you're not able to kind of see a reference point. And then because we're also at this like precipice where like a lot of people, English तो like अब native language हो गई, Urdu, Punjabi, Sindhi, Pashto, सारे जो है ना लोग भूलते जा रहे हैं, and then you're kind of like you're in this transition phase where one of the main things that I keep going and struggling with is वही जो आपने बात करी है कि आप the thing that you said about the mentor Iqbal Kaisar, I think you mentioned, जो उनका नाम था, was कि he wasn't an intellectual by learning books, but he was an intellectual by experiences. और ये बहुत दफा होता है कि हम बहुत सारी चीजें सीख सकते हैं because of experience. And there's that whole wisdom that हमारे बुजुर्गों में, like our parents or parents generation have lived these lives, right? The unfortunate truth about, I think, our society, and I think you mentioned this, and also the reason why I love your work is like you're putting it in English and people are able to kind of, like, at least I was able to understand a lot of it, was that we don't have good documentation, and it's very difficult that you happen upon a person like you were able to happen upon. So finding what you really want to find, or being able to kind of put yourself in these scenarios and in these situations jahan pe, you can really absorb everything that is to be learned here. Because I mean, if you look at the different civilizations, you look at the different kind of geographies within Pakistan, it's so diverse. Like Punjab is completely different from Sindh, is completely different from KP, and like all of these, like, there's so much to offer. So how do you, like, one, I'd love to kind of understand your perspective on how do we change, or do you see a change in the documentation of historical kind of references? And a lot of your work was also to do with spirituality, with Sikhism, and then folklore. Folklore is something for me that's been like, I mean, Dastaangoi comes from folklore. It comes from Amir Hamza ki jo dastanein thi. And it's so beautiful, and it's one of the first kind of ways of storytelling. लेकिन जब आप अब देखते हैं, सस्सी पन्नू देख लो आप, हीर रांझा देख लो आप, like all of the other kind of things that exist, we're kind of losing that. We're losing that the beauty of folklore that used to be. So how do you, I mean, I think I've asked way too many questions. I've kind of confused myself as well. But like, there's so many things that have happened, right? Like, I'd love to kind of get your perspective on one, the documentation side of things, and second, the evolution of language and folklore that's been going on.
Yeah, no, I think I think folklore is something that I'm personally very interested in, and I feel like folklore still is not really understood, like what folklore is has to offer. Like folklore, so I, for example, I'm exploring Waris Shah's Hiranja for my latest project, and the more you get into it, I mean, just the depth of history, the depth of philosophy, just the depth of gender relations that exists in this small 100-page book is absolutely incredible. Right? So it can, so that book, for example, Waris Shah's Heer, let's say, can tell you more about Punjab's religiosity and Punjab's history than, of course, real history books. And there's a reason for that, right? Because our culture, and that's true for most of South Asia, our culture was dominantly oral, like religion, history, philosophy, everything was sort of transferred from one generation to another through this oral culture, which was the sort of bedrock upon which our society was established. But through colonialism, of course, what happens is that the colonial state or the British think of folklore is sort of looked down upon, oral culture is looked down upon, and written sources are what are celebrated, right? So what happens over time is that written text about religion, about Islam, about Hinduism, about philosophy, about Sikhism eventually gain precedence. And over time, what happens is that आपकी जो native elite who are educated in those educational institutions that are set up by the British, also sort of adapt or are socialized into that, looking down upon folk, looking down upon the shrine culture, among many other things, and sort of understanding. So our understanding of, let's say, religion, our understanding of Islam, our understanding of Hinduism, Sikhism, and our history is shaped by those colonial narratives, which has now become the dominant. And folk then almost becomes this island, this repository of a tradition which used to be a dominant tradition in Punjab or in South Asia, but has now sort of receded to the past. So I think, yeah, I think for me, increasingly, what has happened is that when I was initially doing sort of my work, so I was approaching these things from that, of course, this educated colonial mindset, post-colonial, the idea that Hinduism kya hai, Sikhism kya hai, Islam kya hai, folk kya hai. I think over time, the more I've gotten into it, I've started seeing कि boundaries कितनी fluid हैं कि इतना आप clearly distinct नहीं कर सकते कि कहाँ पे folk खत्म होता है और religious literature शुरू होता है, कहाँ पे Hinduism खत्म होता है और Sikhism शुरू होता है. I mean, these are very modern constructs. Like there was not so much inter sort of borrowing that is happening, which this narrative sort of misses out. Yeah, so I think, I mean, I'm not sure if I'm answering your question, but I feel like also, I think also when I started doing this, I remember it was time, I think there were like a few. I mean, I know Salman Rashid, for example, used to write a lot about history and folk, and I think he probably was the only sort of writer writing in English. And then I started writing it, and I think फिर Majid Sheikh के articles आते थे in Dawn, वो भी आते हैं, so talking a bit about history and folk. But then the point was कि बहुत कम उस time जो है बात होती थी, and particularly from a Hindu or a Sikh perspective. So what I started doing at that point was that I started doing ethnographic work. So I started visiting Hindu communities and Sikh communities in Pakistan and started writing about them. I think what has happened though in the past 10, 12 years is that there is now much more literature on it. I think there is definitely much more interest. So I see many more articles in Dawn. I see many more articles in different newspapers and magazines talking about folk, taking a little more seriously. And I feel like things are changing. And you're absolutely right. I think there's still a dearth of literature. And I think one reason why I've written, let's say, so much about this is that I essentially wanted to read all of this that I ended up writing. So I approached my writing in a very simple manner, in the sense that I would have liked to read all of this, which was not available to me to read. So now I'm going to sort of create that literature, and that's essentially my journey that has been.
I mean, that's the best way to kind of do it, man. Like you're answering your own question, basically. जो आपके खुद की जो wants and your needs and जो curiosities, and you're basically kind of solving for that. And I think that's truly where the passion and where the love kind of comes from, and you can see it in the work. So, you know, what was really interesting for me in this period as well is like जो आपने बात करी ना fluidity की, like the religious fluidity and the ethnic and the geographic kind of fluidity that exists in folklore, and the messages that kind of are able to kind of come through. It tells you of the stories of the past as well, right? Like Sikh, Hindu, Muslim, सब एक साथ इकट्ठे रहते थे. And the amount of knowledge that you can extrapolate, like you said, from just 100-page book or a 50, like that has been transcended. जो एक कहानी जो लोग बताते थे, and within that you're getting the knowledge of how people, like there's an article that you had written about the river Chenab, और जो उसकी जो story थी एक, and the amount of stuff that you learn from historical perspectives and from the religious perspectives, and of just that, the heroism or the struggles and the lessons that they teach. You know what I'd be very curious about is like, what is a comparative or a comparison in this day and age that is able to give you just as much? Because pehle zamane mein the poetry also tells you so many different things. If you read a poem by Faiz and you look at the context in which it was written, the Urdu in which it was written, there's so many different messages that go within it, right? So if we take those examples, I'd be very curious, like especially in the work that you're doing now, how do we extrapolate and how do we kind of compare what was and what is the kind of the derivatives these days?
Yeah, I think it's a great question. It's something I've been thinking a lot about. I mean, right. So, for example, like I think one of the biggest irony that many educated kids, especially studying at elite universities or schools in Pakistan, which I of course am a part of, is that I mean we're taught Shakespeare at a very young age, for example, which is absolutely brilliant. I mean, I studied Shakespeare in grade 9, let's say, and I be very honest, I didn't understand a word of Shakespeare at that point, and I don't think anybody did, but that's not really the point. And I'm still sure that kids are taught. Now, increasingly, of course, as my understanding of literature has developed, like I really don't think, essentially, in many ways, kids will be able to understand Shakespeare and literature and his cultural references without really understanding the context of that culture, right? You can't understand Shakespeare, for example, many of his references without understanding Greek mythology, and et cetera, right? And I think that also applies for Bulleh Shah and Shah Hussain and Waris Shah and everybody. Like you can read Bulleh Shah today, but you will not be able to understand many of his references because those references today will have no resonance with him, right? With us, right? So, for example, there are many references to small festivals, to small melas, to small religious shrines that have now completely died away. Right. So, for example, now if you are, let's say, being raised in Lahore or Islamabad or Karachi, and you're completely cut off from that folk culture, which is by design, right? Which is how the colonial state and then the post-colonial state sort of manufactured it. आप खाली पढ़ लेंगे, you can appreciate the words, you can appreciate the rhyme, but you don't know, you won't really be able to understand a lot of sort of nuance that exists there, to a point, and that those cultural references. And I think that's a big sort of, like, I mean, we can't sort of talk about folk within that just as a vacuum. Like that folk exists as with a sort of whole history, right? Similarly, अगर आप फैज की बात करें, तो फैज की भी आपको to really appreciate फैज, you need to understand classical Urdu poetry. So you have to understand the tradition that comes from Khalid, that comes from me, and then you really understand कि ये political reference जो है वो क्या है, right? So, for example, अगर शाह हुसैन है या बुल्ले शाह है या वारिस शाह है, अगर हीर या रांझा की बात करता है, so who is हीर रांझा? I mean, for sure, the story तो वो है, exist करती है, but हीर is also a symbol, and Raja is also a symbol, and that symbol is something which has traveled to Waris Shah. It took about 500, 600 years. It was symbol pehle ek character tha, but over time that symbol became a symbol of a deity, and that symbol is also not coming from that symbol, and of course is coming from the bhakti tradition of Krishna and Radha. So ab hi Ranja ki jo puri jo nuance hai, just that one word of Ranja, कि Ranja Ranja Kukti mein ape Ranja hui, like, I mean, that itself, like, okay, sure, you became Ranja, like, let's say, when I first read that verse, like, आपको वो उसकी वो nuance समझ नहीं आती कि point क्या है, but then when you understand कि ये जो philosophical tradition है इसके पीछे, जो इसके पीछे पूरा एक Islamic philosophy of monoism, and essentially bhakti tradition जो है of devotion and piety-based religion, then you sort of, when you come with that background, then the beauty of folk sort of really, then that's where folk really illuminates in a way. And I think that's a very important thing कि आप खाली हम literature की या हम folk की on its own हम बात नहीं कर सकते. That folk is a product of a particular culture, of a particular tradition, of a particular philosophy. And to really appreciate what that folk is, we have to really get into have to have that background. So
Yeah.
I'm actually very grateful that I'm exploring Waris Shah after having worked on Punjab after in the past 12 years. अगर मैंने वारिस शाह को मैंने आज से 10 साल पहले अप्रोच किया होता तो मेरी अंडरस्टैंडिंग बहुत ही different होती. I think today I was able to understand, sort of really bring in that understanding of Punjab that through my work I've been able to sort of accumulate. And that's been very helpful.
I completely like usko contextualize karna is a very difficult and a daunting kind of task. Na? Like, lekin on the contrary side of it, I think it's still very beautiful to be able to pick up Shahjur Risalo or any of these Bulle Shah ke kalams, and it still gives you a lot, even if sometimes you don't have that historical context and the nuances jo aapko nahi beshak pata ho, just like you've studied it for 12 years, but if the stuff that I would be able to pull out will definitely not be the same as the depth of knowledge that you'll have. But there's still the beauty of these things for me, at least folklore, has always been that no matter where you are on your journey to explore culture, ethnicity, all of these different things, it still is very enriching as an experience, because there are lessons, there are things to be taken out which are so like deeply rich कि हमेशा कुछ ना कुछ निकलता है उसके बाद में, like you read it and you're like, wow, I did not anticipate like this would be something that I would learn, or this is something that would be applicable to today's world in that context, and it's still just as important. These days I've been like, I just bought a book of Shahjur Risalo that's translated, and I'm like super excited to get the perspective of Sindh. Haroon, what I'd be really curious about is, जब आप travel करते हो, like whenever when you are doing field research, what is your procedure? What is the thing that you go for to kind of extrapolate when you go into, let's say, अगर आप कसूर जा रहे हो और आप like लाहौर में कुछ कर रहे हो, या like किसी गांव में कहीं आप जा रहे हो, what are the things that that are the top of your list? Like, do you have like people to talk to, the questions that you ask, like what are some of the questions that you would ask, for instance? Like, what is your way of doing research?
I think firstly, like, I mean, if I could just comment on your point, I think पहले आपने भी किया कि how when you approach folk today, of course you can glean something which is very, very useful. I think that's absolutely correct. I think that's the beauty of literature, where when you approach it, and if you approach that literature at a different time period, you can still find some resonance, right? So, for example, Bulle Shah was writing about challenging religious rituals in 1800 Kasur, different contexts, pre-partition, different Muslim culture is still sort of the dominant culture, etc., etc. And so he's writing in a very different context, but you read Bulle Shah today with a very changed context, and there is still something about his message that sort of resonates with us, and that's the beauty of folk in that sense. So coming to the second question, I think it really depends on what kind of research I'm doing, right? So, for example, जब पहले मैं ethnography कर रहा था with let's say the religious minorities, then it was a very structured way almost. I had a set of questionnaire that I would go in and sort of do a very interview kind of research. But also, having said that, I think I over time have realized that after just structured interviews, and you can go in with your own set of interviews, but that becomes very problematic because a lot of times you are imposing your own understanding of a particular concept upon people. But when you approach a particular interview with a sort of just as a conversation, and allowing that conversation to sort of flow into whatever direction it can go, and then sort of taking out your story from there, I think over time something that's I've realized, as opposed to going with my own understanding and my own questions, I just sort of go to a place, and if it's an interview extensive kind of paper or article that I'm writing, उसमें फिर it's more conversational as opposed to sort of me going with my own questions. But also, like, so a lot of my work also then does not really have interviews. So I mean, I would go to, let's say, Katasra, Purana Gurdwara hai, and I'm not really talking about people there. I'm talking about that particular place and its history. So I think a lot of times then it's a conversation that I'm having with myself. It's a conversation that I'm having with that place. It's almost like it's a very metaphysical sort of spiritual journey in that sense. And I'm using the word spiritual very carefully because, of course, it has its own connotations. But it's just hard to describe, whatever. But the idea is that over time, I've also realized that a lot of travel journey that you do especially travel writing and especially to heritage sites. Like a lot of that travel also happens internally.
Yeah.
Like, so there is sort of a conversation that you're happening. So I think increasingly what I've started doing is relying more upon my own sort of internal voice and having a conversation, because my last book, which was on Lahore, focused more on sites as opposed to people and interviews. So उसमें फिर my entire conversation, my entire procedure was about going to a place and essentially just seeing how I feel about that place, and what is that place doing to me? What kind of conversations am I having with that place? And of course, I mean, मैं अगर किसी और दिन जाता वहाँ पे मेरी बिल्कुल different conversation होगी, and that's okay. And that's the beauty of how this sort of work emerges. So I think with Walking with Nanak, Imagining Lahore, which is my two last works, because I'm talking more about the space, then I sort of have a more internal journey. And कभी बारी होता है कि वहाँ पे उस space में somebody comes to you or you end up talking to somebody, but it is not really planned, but it just happens. And then you have tea or you have a conversation with somebody. And that conversation becomes very interesting because it tells you a different story about that place from a local perspective. And then that can find a place in the story, in the article or not. But I think I've increasingly sort of abandoned this journalistic approach of going to a place, getting interviews, which I find very problematic.
You know what? I absolutely love that. And that approach resonates with me very much, because when you are open, the way the world kind of works, एक तो वो बात हो गई कि आपने जो ना अपने अंदर conversation करनी, I completely believe that, and I completely believe that it is how you are feeling, how you are in your mind space, in the self, when you actually experience travel or a place or even a conversation, because जो perspective आपको आज मिलेगा वो necessarily कल नहीं मिलेगा, because you've learned some of the things, or you're mentally in another space, or in your heart you're in another place. So I think that is like a very unique lens जो लोग अपने डाल सकते हैं, which I love, because you really get that unique kind of perspective, rather than like, वही सवाल जवाब, which will give you a lot of depth maybe, but it won't give you a more personal kind of approach to research or to a place. Now, the other thing that I find very fascinating is, like there was like 5 years where I was just traveling with no purpose, just like going around and like seeing how different countries, different cities, different places affect me. But it's really weird how your perspective changes, but also the thing that you said, randomly कोई conversation हो गई चाय पी ली किसी के साथ, and it's really weird how sometimes the world works in a way where you have a question in your mind that you have kind of manifested, and you go there and you end up meeting someone, and the conversation just like gravitates towards the question that you had in your mind, and it goes somewhere where like it just blows your mind. Like so many times ऐसी हरकतें हुई हैं मेरे साथ, which just I could never have previewed. Again, this was more on a personal basis, but I'd love to kind of see what were some, like, did this ever happen to you? Like, does this resonate with you? Like you went and you had some kind of conversation or some kind of experience. And subsequently, I'd like to ask you about experiences actually. What are 3 experiences that have changed your life the most?
Yeah, I think you're absolutely right. And I'm also thinking in terms of like psychology. So what happens is, let's say that, so this is how I'll explain it. If there is a conversation that I'm having with myself, or there's a question that is sort of lurking in my mind, and I go to a particular place and I'm having a conversation with somebody about random thing, I mean, that sort of lurking thought will find a way to come out through my body language or through certain words. Right? So for example, I'm thinking about this one trip that I did to Kanganpur, which is a small city close to Kasur, and it's an old historical city. And I was there for Walking with Nanak. And वहाँ पे काफी interesting story है, because Nanak essentially the story is that Nanak went to Kanganpur, and the people of Kanganpur essentially rejected him because they thought he was a fake jogi or whatever, and they sort of threw stones at him and forced him to leave that place. And Nanak then curses that place by saying that you should always be, that people of your city should grow, the city should grow. And the idea was, okay, the city grows, and the people of the city will not leave, and they will not spread their evilness. Anyway, so I had read that story in the morning, and I was traveling to Kanganpur. And that story sort of was in my mind, Kanganpur, Nanak cursed these people, and these. So there was this idea that ये शहर शायद इतना अच्छा नहीं है, बुरे लोग हैं. And then so it was interesting कि मैं जिस तरह when I'm there and I'm looking at Nanak's Gurdwara there, and talking to a few people, that I'm constantly approaching it through that lens, imagining Nanak must have come here, and then ये इस तरह के लोग होंगे, interaction हो रहा होगा. They did not really see him as whatever. Like, so वो काफी interesting था कि मेरे लिए कि like my entire conversation with anybody in that town was shaped by that experience that Nanak had written. And that was I was just sort of an interesting how my experience was shaped by his experience and how I had approached that. And then I go to this other place जहाँ पे Nanak who had blessed that place. वहाँ पे वो approach बहुत different है. And those people are offering me chai, and I'm like, see, these are good people. And Kanganpur people, I mean, even though somebody offered chai there as well, but perception था कि नहीं ये शहर. It's just like so an interesting sort of experience in that sense. And of course, that's happened a lot of times. I think for me, I think what has also happened, like especially with certain journeys, what happens like, so I mean, somebody like Nanak, for example, that I have loved and appreciated for such a long time, that even like somebody like Bhagat Singh, for example, who has had such an important impact in Lahore. And I was reading him at a very different point in my life and got really inspired by him in many ways. I think a lot of times my journeys become spiritual in the sense that when I go to a place that is associated with Bhagat Singh, or that is associated with Nanak, and other people that I really admire, I almost feel like I am in their presence. I almost feel like, and not in a physical sense, but and not in a chronological sense, but in a sense that I see history unfolding while it is there. So a lot of that work, of course, is very imaginative. So that's also the point. Like, you can physically observe a place, and you can see nothing. You can see a horrible place. Right? I'll give you one more example. कि लाहौर में एक बहुत मशहूर चौक है, शादमान चौक, जहाँ पे भगत सिंह is supposed to have been hanged, and there's a demand to rename that chalk to Bhagat Singh Chalk. That's a long demand. And वो अगर आप chalk देखें, like if you see the roundabout, it is such an ugly place. Like it is the ugliest roundabout in Lahore because it is hideous, like, for all practical reasons. And then whenever, and I, of course, when I used to pass that chalk without being aware of that story, बिल्कुल मेरा interaction उस जगह से बहुत फर्क था. But then when I read that story and when I engaged with Bhagat Singh, suddenly that same space becomes something else. It transforms into a beautiful place that I just want to be at all times. So वो बड़ा एक interesting experience होता है कि आपकी अपनी जो changing, आपका अपना जो है knowledge or your own understanding, what does your own imagination do to your perception of a city or a community or a locality. So sorry, your second question was about three
experiences that have changed you the most. I love this answer, by the way, like what you just said there, how, and it's so important कि आपका जो perspective होता है, एक ही चीज जो आपने पूरी जिंदगी आपने वही चीज देखी होगी, and then all of a sudden you flip. And that's, for me, that's also like coming back to how we started this, which is like preservation and being able to access more knowledge about Pakistan and about our places and about our sites and like about our history. Because a lot of people, I mean, me included, I don't know Jack. Like, the more I learn and the more people I talk to, a lot of like there is it's like a lot of people are oblivious to a lot of our history. And when you do give them that perspective, you kind of start to eradicate a little bit of the colonialism, the effects of colonialism, and bring back the pride into Pakistan and to the essence of this area, this land, the geography and the history. So I really truly believe that the importance of preservation, not just for preservation's sake, but also to kind of remove and unlearn the effects that colonialism have had on us. And I think that is extremely important. So thank you for that. The question that was three experiences that have changed you the most.
Yeah, I think it's hard to essentially pinpoint any three experiences. And I think also a lot of times you have these experiences and you don't even realize the importance of those experiences till after a long time, right? I know, for example, like my meeting with Iqbal Kaisar which has fundamentally changed how I approach my life in many ways. I think one thing that really stood out for me in that one lecture that he was giving at LUMS, it was a lecture about Sikh history of Lahore, but in that he mentioned Thokar Niyaz Beg, जो कि लाहौर के अंदर एक बड़ा मशहूर इलाका है और मोटरवे, और मेरा घर जो है उसके काफी पास था लाहौर में उस टाइम. And I used to pass that place every day. And अगर आपने ठोकर न्याज बेग देखा है, there's nothing extraordinary about ठोकर न्याज बेग, right? It's poverty ridden, it's pollution, everything like जो आप typical आपकी association होती है with the developing city or whatever it is. And he mentioned how Thokan Yazbek was at one point in history was the capital of Punjab for 6 months. And suddenly I'm like, what, Thokan Yazbek? Like, you don't, like, what do you mean Thokan Yazbek? I think that just that one comment. So I then went to him. I'm like, what do you mean? And then he's like, अच्छा नहीं बड़ा पुराना. He actually Lahore से, it's not Lahore से पुराना नहीं, but ये 500-700 साल पुराना एक गांव है ठोकर न्याज़बेग. ओवर टाइम जब शहर बड़ा हुआ तो वो पूरा जो एक गांव है वो शहर के अंदर इनकॉर्पोरेट हो गया. तो अब हम वी डोंट थिंक अब न्याज़बेग की अपनी कोई डिस्टिंक्ट आइडेंटिटी नहीं है. उसकी दैट आइडेंटिटी हैज बीन सबस्यूम्ड बाय द सिटी ऑफ लाहौर, व्हिच इज unfortunately has happened with many other villages and towns around Lahore. I think so. Then I told him कि मुझे आप please जब भी आपको टाइम हो मुझे कभी आप न्याज़बेग लेके जाएं. I would like to see those old buildings and temples. I think also that traveling through Nyazbek and also realizing कि ये चीजें जो मुझे वो दिखा रहे हैं या पुरानी buildings या पुराने मंदिर, like they're always there, but हमारा वो एक maybe training ऐसी होती है कि we're not meant to, our engagement with the city essentially changes with where we are coming from. तो अगर आप सुबह स्कूल जा रहे हैं या आपकी वो फोकस ही नहीं है तारीख की तरफ, या we also think of history in Pakistan, we think of history as larger. एक तो हम यूरोपियन हिस्ट्री एक तो होती है वर्ल्ड हिस्ट्री, राइट, एक वो इशू है. Then we think of history in India as a big Mughal history, जो कि लाहौर फोर्ट और बादशाही मस्जिद में जाके खत्म हो जाती है. We don't think of how that history plays out in smaller areas, smaller towns, in my surroundings. And suddenly I started observing these historical sites around me. So अब मैं कहीं भी travel करूँ, for example, like that becomes how I approach a city, looking at older buildings, looking at older trees, looking at older shrines, let's say, things that had been there forever, but my understanding and my approach to those places had changed. I think it's very fundamental. I think also, like, I mean, I can't really pinpoint my finger on when that changed for me, but I think my understanding of Sufi shrines really changed over the course of time. I think because growing up in Pakistan, growing up in an urban, Sunni, middle class Punjabi, I mean, as privileged as one can be in Pakistan, right? Growing up in that understanding of Sufi, after Sufi shrines, there's almost this looking down upon. So the more educated you are, the more looked down, you look down upon Sufi shrines. And of course, that's also by design, because idea is ये civilized Islam नहीं है, ये proper Islam नहीं है, and we're not following true religion. And that's kind of where I was coming from in many places, in many ways, even if not, let's say, ostensibly, but like that was how I understood. And I think over time, like my understanding of what is happening at Sufi shrines has shifted, has changed. I mean, it's hard for me to pinpoint a finger, like to say exactly when that happened, because I was traveling to so many Sufi shrines that happened. I think also thinking of Sufi shrines as not just religious spaces, but thinking of them as historical sites, thinking of history through religion, through Sufi shrine, through mounds. I think, and then I also then see that connection between graveyards and Sufi shrines. I gave this entire presentation a few months ago with the idea that you can really talk about the entire history of the city of Lahore, for example, through its Sufi shrines. And those Sufi shrines and the connection between Sufi shrines and Hindu temples and Sikh gurdwaras and sort of graveyards, they're all interconnected. They're not these silos, but they are sort of always having a conversation with each other. That was a very important moment. And I think also, like, me going to Nankana Sahib at Guru Nanak's big festival. I mean, I think the first time I went there was in 2008 or 9. Much before I started writing on Guru Nanak. But I think that first trip in many ways really influenced me, because here I was in a Muslim country, of course, but then all around me were Sikh devotees talking about Guru Nanak. And then, so then I for some reason, I started traveling Nankana Sahib along, काफी ज़्यादा मैं करना शुरू हो गया. And on one of these travels, what used to happen was that I used to walk through Nankana Sahib. And I started imagining Guru Nanak and Bhai Mardana walking those same streets. So Bhai Mardana was Guru Nanak's Muslim devotee who traveled with him. So I started imagining him, how he would have interacted with the city, and essentially him being that same. So just sharing that same space with somebody that I had admired and I was admiring, like that itself was a very transformative experience. Yeah.
That's awesome. I would love to see the presentation, by the way. And like I'll ask you a couple of things afterwards as well. Like, I want some of these resources, man, like where I can find more of these stories. Like I need to pick up your book. I haven't read your book, like, and I need to pick up the Nanak book, because the stories that you're telling me sound fascinating. And I've never been to the Kartarpur corridor. I've only been to Punjab Sahib, but like getting this perspective and reading your articles and then going to these places, like I can't wait when like lockdown's a little bit eased up. I think they're getting there. Harun, आखिरी सवाल आपसे होगा कि how do you unpack Pakistan like in a quick? I mean, it's a very difficult way to kind of be able to do that, but how do you do that for someone who hasn't been to Pakistan in like a short way?
Right. I think also like it really depends. Am I talking to a white audience? Am I talking to somebody who's Pakistani origin but living not in Pakistan? So who am I talking to here?
I mean, actually, you know what? Like, no one has ever asked me that. So, and it's fascinating because I would even also growing up never wanted to come to Pakistan. So I would be more curious about how do you do that for Pakistanis themselves or expats.
Yeah,
like,
I think
diaspora.
because then it just the whole conversation changes, right? Because how they see Pakistanis view Pakistan in different parts of the world is shaped by. I mean, there is still a constant engagement with Pakistan at some level, even if you're not actively involved. Like you still have some understanding of what is happening in the country, the news, or etc. etc. And of course, a white audience or a non-Pakistani audience will have a very different interaction, perception of the city, of the country. Sorry. Yeah, but I think what is really happening, I think globally and sort of people not living in Pakistan, let's say Canada or the US, I think what has happened in the past 1 year, particularly with Black Lives Matter, and I don't know if you're following them in Canada, maybe there's a huge indigenous, they found graves of
Yeah,
215 kids. That's what,
kids, yeah.
yeah. So there is a whole conversation that has been happening, and of course with Gaza and Israel as well. Like, there's a whole conversation that has been happening in many parts of the world about colonization, about decolonization and the need to decolonize. And of course, there are some spaces that need physical decolonization, and indigenous experiences in Gaza, of course, are examples of that. Kashmir is an example of that. But then of course, we have societies like Pakistan, for example, or India and other places, which have been decolonized, but a lot of those structures of colonization still continue to exist. And it's also very interesting how those structures exist through our education, how those structures exist through our police system, through our judiciary, through everything, right? And I think that's where the need to decolonization really needs to begin, right? I think I was talking to a friend of mine recently, and the whole idea was, once again, I mean, I keep on coming back to Waris Shah because that's something I'm thinking a lot about. So I don't know, were you educated in Pakistan or were you educated in?
I just moved to Pakistan 2 months ago. I was outside my whole life. I was in Canada and I was in Dubai.
Right. Yeah. So I mean, if you talk to a lot of people who did their O levels in Pakistan और उन्होंने उर्दू पढ़ी है, तो अगर उनको उर्दू में कुछ भी याद नहीं होगा, उनको उर्दू में एक चीज याद होगी, वो होगा an essay on शाह वलीउल्लाह. क्योंकि वो ऐसे आता था, हर साल वही ऐसे आता था कि आप शाह वलीउल्लाह के बारे में लिखें.
I don't even know Shah Waliullah. So I'd like a little bit.
And that's okay. Like he's actually not a very important figure in that sense, but he's become a very important figure. So Shah Waliullah was this Islamic scholar who was living around the same time as Waris Shah.
Okay.
And he's living in Delhi, and Waris Shah is living in Kasoor or in Punjab. So Waris Shah की जो understanding of religion आपको बड़ी clearly नजर आती है हीर रांझा से, कि Waris Shah हीर रांझा के अंदर एक top पे वो Quran quote करता है, then he quotes Gita, then he quotes Mahabharata. Like his understanding of religion is very fluid, and he's bringing everybody together. And in many ways, that reflected the religiosity of Punjab. That's the pre-colonial Punjab. कि Waris Shah उसको बहुत beautifully reflect करता है. Shah Waliullah is writing at the same time, sitting in Delhi, and he's writing in Arabic and Persian, right? So he's an elitist. Waris Shah is Punjabi, writing in Punjabi, whereas he can write these languages, but he's still writing in Punjabi. Shah Waliullah क्या लिख रहा है around the same time? He's saying that Islam and religion has been corrupted, and we need to remove all these Hindu influences that have existed, and that's the reason why the Islamic rule is being threatened. And he then thinks of M. Shah Abdali कि ये एक असल मुस्लिम रूलर है, जब तक ये अफगानिस्तान से इंडिया या पाकिस्तान जो एरिया है वहां पर नहीं आएगा, we will never be able to become good Muslims and whatever. Right? So you can see his understanding of Islam and religion is the exact opposite of what Waris Shah's is. Now, at that point, nobody cared about Shah Waliullah because he was such a peripheral figure. And Waris Shah's ideology is the mainstream understanding of religion. Like far forward all these years, 200 years, today our kids in Pakistan are taught Shah Waliullah and they are not taught Waris Shah. And the reason, and the same question comes every year in O-level Urdu. Shah Waliullah, unko kuch bhi yaad nahi, unko Shah Waliullah yaad hota hai, which is by like, why not? Like, why don't have a chapter on Waris? So why isn't there a chapter on Waris Shah? In lesson, not even lesson, Urdu nahi hai, Punjabi nahi hai, Pakistan studies mein. Bulle Shah pe chapter kyun nahi hai? Shah Hussain pe chapter kyun nahi hai? But Shah Waliullah pe kyun hai? Because his understanding of religion essentially aligns with how you want religion to be seen in Pakistan. Which is of course very, very problematic, right? So I think that's, so essentially decolonization really needs to happen. So my unpacking would be that how we understand Pakistan and how we understand its culture and how we understand its religion and history and everything is shaped by that colonial enterprise, and that really needs to sort of, it's really magnificent. It's not just about color. It's not just about black and white and brown and racism of that sense, which of course exists, which is of course even older than colonialism in South Asia in many ways. But how we understand ourselves and our history and our languages, all of those are shaped by that colonial enterprise, and that continues to impact. And in many ways, it's much more powerful than it ever was, because the state has become much more powerful. The education structure has now spread. So the more educated you get, the more colonized you get.
You get discrimination about you. Like you have, it's not just a gaon that you're doing it. Now you're doing it on a mass scale.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah. So that'll be my sort of unpacking. Our understanding of Pakistan and its history needs to be decolonized. And education I see as the primary space where that happens.